Welcome back, my friends. We're about to get into chapter 6. Just wanted to introduce you to the class mascot, the one and only Charlotte. She just wants to say hi to everyone. And should we start with part 1 or 2? Part 1, obviously, right? We'll start with part 1. Teach a little bit about what's coming down the path for you in childhood. While mother, one that's in childhood's at school, but here's Charlotte. A couple of you have mentioned liking seeing her, so I appreciate that. That's a pretty cool comment to make. So anyways, let's get into it. Chapter 6. Charlotte says, what's up? Welcome, my dear Nipsing friends in the NU Digital Classroom. I hope everyone's doing well today. We're going to get into some of the dynamics around the social and emotional development of personality during childhood. And in chapter 5, we really were looking at the cognitive changes that were happening in the processing and structure of the brain, and then how that's kind of connected with some of the more physical changes in things like body size and heart and lungs and stuff like that. And then today we're going to be looking at how that manifests in the actual lived experience of the person, right? So like how these changes in brain structures and brain processing and in these physical changes, and now this child's going to school and being exposed to all this new peer network, and what's the effect of that on both their kind of development and their sense of self and personhood. And that's what we're going to be getting into today. So, what do I say? Sometimes grab a hot drink and a warm chair, or a warm drink and a comfy chair, and I feel blessed that I have the opportunity to share some ideas with you. And today we're going to get into a lot of heavy things, because we're going to be looking at basically this idea of what happens when the primary, or the kind of sole, or at least primary developmental influence on the kid, which has always been the family. What happens when all of a sudden now that kid leaves and goes for 8 hours of their day, 5 days a week, for 30 hours of their week, and they start to spend more time with the people around them at school than even their family members, or maybe even their parents. Probably not technically their parents, but at least like all their cousins and stuff, right? So it's this change in the social world. And what's this changing social world to the child? Welcome back. Missed you. Hope you're doing well. Let's get into this. See, I think I'm gonna keep going with this light and sound setup. It's like I got a face for radio anyways. It's not like you're missing anything not having me and a close-up of my face the entire time I'm talking. But what I've actually found, it's interesting because you're psych interested students, so it's weird how much this setting has actually kind of changed my whole mood. And I did this with a live class last week, and I did it in your last presentation, and I'm doing it now, and it's like, I don't know, I think we've all been sitting down staring at our desks like we're like, cubicle workers for the last couple years, and it's like eating at our souls. And it's like good for me to stand up and even just pretend like there's stars around me and that I'm in a natural setting, and be myself and wear a shirt from the old camp. And it's like, if I'm sure all your other teachers are wearing button shirts and stuff, but I have to just be me as best as I can, and hope we resonate. The idea here is, well, it's interesting to make like a kind of point like that when I'm about to describe this concept of self-understanding. It's like realizing who you are. It's like if you hate my shirt and you don't like how I talk, and you think that the stars are lame, and you don't like the little bit of background music to hide the hum of the computer, it's like, what am I supposed to do? Okay, fine. It's like, I'm committed at this point, and people aren't always going to love every single thing you do. And if that's your goal and you score very high on agreeableness in your big 5, it's like you got to learn how to start upsetting people, because people that score very high in agreeableness, that sounds like it's a good thing, but it also makes you more manipulatable and more vulnerable to people that are maybe less good people than you. So not to get off point immediately, self-understanding is this idea that as the kid is now, well, as we now can start to correctly use the word kid, right? Which is, it's weird I said it like that because that's obviously not a technical term, but it's obviously, we're not talking about babies anymore, right? We're not talking about infants and newborns. Now we're talking about kids, and kids are they're making this incredible, these leaps and bounds changes in how they're understanding themselves. And I want to kind of spend some time at the beginning of this presentation talking about Erikson, and how Erikson talked a lot about how we have these kind of key developmental stages. And the one that we've talked about already is trust versus mistrust, right? That the child's in this place. And this is where it's like Erikson, I've made the point that, and you can all argue or whatever, and a lot of you did on your Giants of Psychology, went all different ways on the importance of all these key figures in psychology. And I was so impressed in those assignments. And some of you did speak to Freud, and some of you had issues with some, but supported some of his ideas. What I thought you all did well is even people that had critiques about things, set up their critique and made their point logically. Which sounds obvious, but is not always the way people respond to Freud. And so, okay, but anyways, all that aside, I would still say Freud's the most important psychologist ever. Piaget's the most important developmental psychologist ever. Jung's maybe the most interesting psychologist ever. Viktor Frankl's probably the psychologist you should read the most. And Erik Erikson is probably the psychologist that is most surface level understood. And again, I'm definitely not responding to anyone that did that as their assignment. Those were some of actually the deepest explorations of Erikson I've seen. But what I'm referring to in this specific comment is that a lot of times if you take, say, an intro psych class, you're like, yeah, Erikson says baby has to get trust or not. Okay, next slide. And it's like, no, not next slide. What you're really saying is the baby's forming this whole model of what their world even is, what other people are, what relationships are, what mom and dad are, what family means, what environment is. And none of it's articulated. None of it's thought through like an adult. Remember, this Piaget's massive contribution. It's not like they're thinking in a weaker adult way. It's an entire different processing system. They're completely sensory motor. At that point, you can probably argue they're, for lack of a better term, unconscious, but they're not unconscious. They're sensory motor, to combine Freud and Piaget. And so, trust versus mistrust isn't a small thing. It might be the biggest thing there is, because it really represents, well, you have to ask the question, what are you trusting? If I say it's so important for you to establish trust, of what? Of the responsiveness of your environment, of your role in that environment, of your role with other people, of other people. Or is everything a threat? Right, and Erikson's worry was that if kids don't establish a baseline of trust, then the crisis is the establishment of mistrust. And if you think of what's mistrust, it's at the core essence of things, not believing in the integrity, authenticity, and genuineness of the world. And of that world that lives in the people in your specific environment. And then why that's so problematic is now we're about to get to the stage of childhood, and I know I haven't said almost anything about the actual slide, where that model's about to come to school, right? And we're going to enter into some of these other Erikson considerations, all right? Also, sorry, we've already done trust and mistrust and autonomy versus shame and doubt. So the two, I guess you could, in a general sense, say preschool related ones, like not preschool in the sense of the year before kindergarten, but preschool in the sense of before you go to school. And then the once we get to school ones that we're going to be looking at now are this idea of initiative versus guilt and industry versus inferiority, right? And I'm going to do a slide on each of those concepts. By early childhood, children use their perceptual, motor, cognitive, and language skills to make things happen and become convinced that they're their own person. And It's a wild thought, sort of, but think about what we mean when we say personality development, the development of a person that's a unique individual self. They have this surplus of energy that permits them to approach new areas, even if it seems dangerous, with this undiminished zest and this increased sense of direction. On their own initiative at this stage, children move out exuberantly into the wider social world. The great governor of initiative is conscience. Man, that's a killer sentence. I think I took it right from the book, so I'm not going to take credit for it. The great governor of initiative. So what's a governor? Something that controls. Interesting to think of it that way. Government, control of mind. Governor on a car is something that only lets you drive to a certain speed. The great governor of initiative is this conscience, this, superego, this understanding of what other people think we should be doing. And you can see how that's related to guilt. Children's initiative and enthusiasm may bring out not only rewards but also a guilt, which can lower self-esteem because they want to do these things, and if they feel like they can't, right? So it's sort of interesting to think of how, as the child's starting to become more aware of what others are expecting of them, they start to become also more aware of if they're meeting that or not. And think of what initiative means. It's like, well, and my daughter, my 5-year-old, sort of, and this is the thing, right? A lot of kids are going to be, the stages sort of are what's most emphasized at that age. It's not like, well, it's not like even as adults we don't sometimes struggle with trust or with things like autonomy, right? Even in relationships where it's like, if you feel like the decision making is being dominated by one side, you could say that you felt like you lacked autonomy in that situation. So what Erickson's point wasn't that you move through these things and then you never deal with them again, but that certain developmental tasks are highly emphasized at different spots, right? Like identity might be something we struggle with through our whole life, but it's probably going to rear its head the most during the teen, early 20 years. Parents and teachers play a key role in fostering initiative. Okay, so if we look at it now, this point, I've described this a lot of times, and I think one way this sort of works for people is if you think of an industry, right, and you just like literally picture, like when I say the word industry, you maybe think of like a factory that makes things, and you know that we have the word industrious, which means like, if you would say that I'm really industrious, that means like you can just give this guy projects and he'll do it. Like he'll make things happen. He'll figure out ways. He'll problem solve. He'll work well in a team. He has in an industrious nature, right? The Industrial Revolution was when Europe basically, people moved in from the town sides to the cities to work in these large factories or mines. So industry, anyways, I got a point there, but industry sort of means this idea of building, right? So it's like why it's important for kids to be at school around other kids doing developmentally appropriate tasks. All of you people interested in early childhood health and education, it's like industry versus inferiority is one of the most important reasons. Kids need to be put in this scenario where they want to be challenged, and if you can construct challenges, that will actually promote their cognitive and social and emotional and personal development. And if you don't, that lack of proving to oneself that you can exert influence on your environment can make people feel less than other people, inferior. Right? And you've heard this term probably before. Inferior is the opposite of the word superior. According to Erickson, middle and late childhood is characterized by the struggle between industry and inferiority. The term industry expresses this dominant theme of the period. The children become interested in how things are made and how they work. When children are encouraged in their efforts to make and build and work, whether building a model airplane or constructing a treehouse or fixing a bike or solving a math problem or cooking, they're developing this sense of industry. Conversely, parents who see their children's efforts at making things as mischief or just making a mess will tend to foster feelings of inferiority. So, sense of self. So what do you think of, one way we assess the sense of self, and if you think a sense of self is like, well, who are you? And at a certain point, to understand someone's sense of self as they're getting older and more verbal, you ask them, and then you look at how they describe themselves. Are they describing very physical characteristics? Are they describing the type of things they do, or the type of person they are, or their beliefs? Two main differences are evident when contrasting self-descriptions that are provided during early childhood with those provided in middle childhood. The first shift is from describing oneself in more concrete physical terms, hair, color, height, whatever, to describing self in more psychological terms. I'm a good friend, I'm funny, I'm good to be around, or saying like you trust one friend more than another wouldn't be another way of talking about psychological things. I'm someone you can trust. In early childhood, young children often provide self-descriptions that are focused on bodily attributes, material possessions, physical games that they like. So I'm someone that has blonde hair and I have hockey equipment and I play hockey. For example, preschool children often describe themselves in terms of activities like play. In middle and late childhood, especially from 8 to 11 years of age, children increasingly describe themselves with psychological characteristics and traits rather than more concrete self-descriptions like younger kids did. Older children are more likely to describe themselves as popular, nice, helpful, smart, dumb. It's from work from, if you're interested in that, the researcher's name's Harter, like Harter, 2006. In addition, during the elementary school years, children become more likely to recognize social aspects of the self. They include reference to social groups in their description, such as referring to things like Girl Guides, or I'm Catholic, or I'm someone that has 2 close friends. Children's self-understanding in these elementary school years starts to increasingly reference social comparison. So this is going to be a key concept today, this idea of social comparison. It's like, I'm good compared to this person, I'm bad compared to this person. Children's self-understanding in the elementary school years, I just read this, increasingly is focused on social comparison. Consider a study by Diane Rubel that in 1983 that investigated a child's use of social comparison and self-evaluation. Children were given a difficult task and then offered feedback on their performance, as well as information about the performance of the other kids their age. The children were then asked for self-evaluations, right? So they're given a task and they're told how other people did and then asked how they did. Children younger than 7 made virtually no reference to the information related to other kids' performances. So you get a kid under 7 to do a task, and then you tell them all these other people did it and this is how they did, and you ask them how they did, and their response is going to be based on how they think they did. It doesn't have this social comparison piece as much yet. However, many children older than 7 included social comparative information in their self-description. You know, I don't think I did as good as this person, but I definitely did better than those 3. That's a huge shift in self-reference. Just a little quick note, one thing that might end up happening is that due to the fact that with these later presentations, I'm not showing you as much sort of heavy biology stuff, so I'm not showing as much visual depictions of it. So the presentations will probably be a little bit shorter, but I do want to get into this idea. So the child's getting older, right? They're developing. You can have these, if you could have these 2 points, and I know you've obviously heard of both these things, but I want to sort of make the point of how they're connected, right? How our self-concept I have their domain-specific evaluation of self. So just like how I think I am at certain things, we have self-concepts related to all kinds of things, like how we see ourselves as being athletic or not, or music. I think I'm a semi-decent athlete for my age. I think I'm a terrible musician. It's like I can easily rate myself on those 2 things, and I think, you know, I'm in between on a lot of things. And I think self-concept, and then if that's kind of like how you have these concepts of who you are and all these different aspects, and then your kind of evaluation of that and how much you value that and how much status you give that, or the other way you could say that is how much esteem you give that conception of yourself, right? So these are intricately linked concepts. So self-esteem may have this global evaluation of the self. The child perceives that they're a good person, or maybe they perceive that they're not a good person, and see why that's so devastating is because then the rest of the world is interpreted through that lens, right? And these low self-esteems we know are associated with all the kinds of things you fear as a parent. So I'll just read this again. As self-esteem refers to this more global evaluation of the self. It's also sometimes referred to as self-worth or self-image. For example, a child may perceive that they're a good person. Although closely related to self-esteem, self-concept refers to domain-specific evaluations of self. Sorry if you can hear Evie a little bit crying. My mom's here. She's with her grandma, and my wife's doing a bit of painting, and I'm just kind of seeing if the audio's catching it or not. If it is, I'll record this later, but I think I'm going to keep going. Children can make self-evaluations in many domain-specific areas of their life, like I was kind of saying, like athletic or academic, appearance, which is devastating too, because we'll get to that later. For example, a child may perceive that they're good at math, but not very athletic. High self-esteem and positive self-concept are important characteristics of a child's well-being. Given the increased social comparison during middle childhood, it's not surprising that during middle childhood, self-concept becomes increasingly differentiated. Right, so it's just getting more and more specific, more idiosyncratic or specific to the person. Remember, we're talking about the development of personhood, personality, and both self-esteem and self-concept are typically decline. And they're probably at their lowest in the teen years. Well, not probably, or certainly. Of course, self-esteem reflects perceptions that do not always match reality. High self-esteem may refer to accurate, justified perceptions of one's worth as a person and successes and accomplishments, but it could also refer to a more arrogant or grandiose or unwarranted sense of superiority over others. In the same manner, low self-esteem may reflect an accurate perception of one's shortcomings, or may be distorted, even pathological insecurities and inferiorities. Low self-esteem has been implicated in overweight and obesity issues and eating disorders, so in all relationships with food, anxiety, depression, suicidal behavior and thoughts, drug use, delinquency. One study reviewed that youth with low self-esteem had lower life satisfaction at age 30. So youths that scored as low self-esteem having lower life satisfaction at 30. That's an interesting finding. Birkeland 2012 is how you would find that. So Birkeland is the person's last name that did that study. Another study found that low and decreasing self-esteem in adolescence was linked to adult depression. The links between self-esteem and school performance are weaker. People only found kind of moderate correlations. Efforts to increase self-esteem at schools haven't always led to increases in performance, and I want to now take a second and talk about why that is and what self-esteem interventions have to be careful, because it only works if you understand why the kid has a self-esteem issue and you address that specific thing specifically. Generalized approaches to building self-esteem, if interpreted by the kid as inauthentic, can actually be making a situation more problematic. Okay, so anyways, I just rambled that, but I have that written out better on the next slide. Alright, I'll catch you there. Teachers, social workers, healthcare professionals, and others are often concerned about low self-esteem in the children they serve. So I often don't just straight up read notes, but I guess I sort of do. I kind of go in and out, right? But I can do that a little bit here. One temptation is to deliver more frequent praise, right? So, and that's understandable, right? There's just kids that you're supporting, and you see that they are struggling with self-esteem, and it's the most natural reaction for you to have as a caring adult would be to try to help them get better in the area that they're struggling. One temptation is to deliver more frequent praise, but a growing body of research suggests caution in using this approach. Too many of today's children grow up receiving praises for mediocre or even poor performance, and as a consequence have an inflated self-esteem. Now, it's like, well, isn't inflated self-esteem good? Well, not necessarily, because it's like going into a game against another sports team thinking you're awesome and they're way better than you, and then you just get killed in the game. And it's like, well, was it better that you felt better about yourself walking to the place? Or you get into almost a Hansel and Gretel scenario. They're like feeding you so much candy that you think it's good, but you're being fattened purposely by the witch. The story of Hansel and Gretel is one of the oldest, and if you actually look into the Grimm brothers, like the roots of that story, it's a dark story about the soul. Narcissistic parents especially overvalue their children's talents, and this then is vividly captured in the title of a book called Dumbing Down Our Kids: Why American Children Feel Good About Themselves But Can't Read, Write, or Add. And that's a devastating book by a person named Sykes, which is Sykes, 1995. In a series of studies, researchers found that inflated praise, although well-intended, may cause children with low self-esteem to avoid important learning experiences such as taking challenging tasks. A study by Kang Lee and others at the University of Toronto in 2017 provided a poignant example of how the type of praise delivered influenced a child's behavior. Preschool children played a game where they're praised in one of two ways. So they're playing this game, right? And some kids are basically being told, oh, smart move, smart move, smart. So notice how it's like the praise is focused on their internal, sort of unchangeable to a way, like their IQ kind of aspects, as opposed to praising the performance, like, oh, that was a good move, right? So it's the difference. It's subtle, sort of, but it's the difference by saying, oh, very smart move, or good move, right? And it's like, are you praising the performance, or are you praising the inherent ability behind it? Some children were praised for the ability, you're so smart, while others were praised for their performance, you did very well this time. Children who were praised for their ability, you're so smart, were more likely to cheat when given an opportunity to do so than were children who were praised for their performance. You did very well this time. Consistent with previous evidence that praising children for intelligence undermines task enjoyment and reduces persistence after failure, this study calls for a very thoughtful approach when praising children. Praising a child for being smart produces pressure to perform well in the future, and in order to meet others' expectations. This pressure can lead to negative behaviors, and we're not just talking about cheating, we're talking also about all kinds of things related to things like anxiety. Researchers have suggested several strategies for improving self-esteem in at-risk children, and the important point is to consider these two things, and I sort of touched on this at the very beginning, but number one, identify the cause of the low self-esteem. Right? What is it that's causing it? Is it because of stuff at home? Is it because of some traumatic past experience? Is it because they just haven't had skill development in that area? It's like, what is the cause? And so what's this basically saying? It's like, it's a person-centered approach, right? It's like the opposite of saying treat it as a blanket thing that one solution fits all. Intervention should target the cause of the low self-esteem. Children have the highest self-esteem when they perform competently in domains that are important to them. Right? The best way to build up a kid's self-esteem is figuring out what's important to them and helping them getting better at those things, not random things. Therefore, it's helpful to encourage children to identify and value their areas of competence, such as things like academic skill, athletic skill, social acceptance. Okay, so number one was identify the cause. Number two, provide emotional support and social approval. Because devastatingly, some people don't have that. Provide emotional support and social approval. Some children with low self-esteem come from conflictual families or from conditions of abuse and neglect and situations in which emotional support is unavailable. In some cases, alternative sources of support can be arranged either informally through the encouragement of a teacher or a coach or another significant adult, or more formally through, places I've argued for a lot, like Big Brothers, Big Sisters. That organization, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, right, where they are literally trying to get a lot of people like your age. And again, if you're kind of at the early stages of your career, if you're around 20, you're looking for volunteer work, and it's like, not only is it field related and good training, it's like actually doing something that is desperately needed. Anyways, I'm just saying it's an awesome idea as and I don't just mean as volunteer so it looks good on your resume, although it absolutely does, and I guarantee people will bring it up in interviews you go on. You're just the type of people that would be awesome at it too, right? So there's desperate needs for that kind of stuff. But here's the other thing, it's like, not, you don't all have to go do that. It's like, but what I do think a lot of you are looking at how to do is, there's pain in the world, but there's also beauty and happiness, and at a very core level, a lot of you are interested in trying to get into situations where you can sow meaning and purpose and happiness and try to help people develop those things and mitigate some of the, and deal with some of the challenges and struggles. But you have to be real with people, because if you're inauthentic and if people see you as fake and you're just saying that to say that, it's like, then it's in one ear and out the other. So this next term that I often describe self-efficacy as, and this is an idea that comes from Bandura, as a more specific word than confidence, right? Or more, you might say someone has, like, I use the example sometimes of the guy I work with, and it's interesting because on the last slide I was talking about Big Brothers, and I worked for an organization sort of like that, but it was called Extended Family, where it was basically the same thing, but supporting kids that had developmental delays or disabilities. And so I worked with this guy. I've talked about it a bunch of times, but like, I think to you already, but basically he really struggled with some things, but was really good at some other things. So you could say, like, the things he struggled at, like, say, interacting with a random person at like a store or something like that, like purchasing something, that interaction was very stressful for him, and he had his self-efficacy in that area was low, which is just, again, a more specific word than confidence, sort of the belief of your ability to, produce the result you're wanting to produce in a specific situation. Right, so you might have, this is you saying that you think you're a good writer, but you have a low level of self-efficacy in relation to how you think you are at math. Maybe you're like, I'm a good writer, but I'm no good at math. It's like, so we all know that we're like more and less confident in different things. Self-efficacy is this belief that one can master a situation and produce a favorable outcome. Bandura, who had this social cognitive theory that was described earlier in the course, states that self-efficacy is a critical factor, right? One of the biggest blocks to being a good writer is thinking that you can't write. It's like, especially if you've deeply internalized that, and especially if you've been told that from people whose opinion you valued. Students with low self-efficacy for learning may avoid learning tasks, especially anything that's challenging. By contrast, children with high self-efficacy eagerly work towards a learning task, right? So people that have learned that in situations they actually can be successful will treat difficult situations as if they're things that you might not be good at now but could eventually get good at. People that have never experienced that are more likely to quit right away. Students with high self-efficacy are more likely to expend effort and persist longer at learning tasks than students with low self-efficacy. Okay. Again, please excuse any little noise. My wife's painting right above, and my mom's with Charlotte. But Evie's at school, which means that door's probably not going to bust open with a direct interference. So it's more just background noise. So, you work with what you have. Now, again, I didn't even need to maybe say that. Say we're friends and you come over to my house and you walk in and I ask you, you sit down, take your coat off, sit on the couch. I'm sitting on the other couch. We're about to watch like a sports game or something, and I say to you like, "Is it too cold for you?" And you're like, "No, the temperature it feels pretty regular." It's like, well, what does regular mean? That was a weird example, but I'm just trying to get into this word, and regular means like, it could be too hot or it could be too cold or it could be regular. It's like this. And regulation in this sense means, and how it's developed is this idea of like, okay, you're kind of at your regular and you can get down, you can get up, and especially when you get up, like when you get upset, can you calm yourself back down? Can you get back to regular? Can you regulate your emotions? And can you self-regulate your emotions, right? So the opposite of that would be like, say, a little child that's having, or like even the baby now, like if Charlotte's crying, she doesn't self-regulate. You can't just expect her to calm herself back down. Like you literally need to give her a soother. Right? A soother's like almost the opposite. Well, I guess if a kid grabbed their own soother, that would actually be self-regulation. So it's not inherently I was gonna say the opposite of self-regulation, and then I caught myself because it's just different. So self-regulation, this ability to bring yourself back to a regulated emotional state, deliberately on purpose, calming yourself down, this deliberate effort to manage your own, whether we're talking about behavior or emotions or thoughts. Okay, so think about that, like behavior and emotions sort of go together, right? So you're in this like wild emotional state. The best example would be like a child having a temper tantrum. It's like that's one of the clearest examples of how your emotion and behavior are almost the same thing, right? Like it's like the physical expression of the emotion, and it's like, I don't know why I did that with my hands, but whatever. And then it's like, and then the thoughts around that. And then we know it's kind of weirdly presented on the slide, but the semicolon kind of indicates a separate point, even though I could have presented that better. But this idea that the better a kid gets at self-regulation is associated with higher levels of social competence and achievement, right? So it's just, that means like kids do better socially the better they are at regulating their own emotions. And at a certain point you're like, yeah, no kidding, that the kids that can calm themselves down better tend to do better at integrating into other groups of kids. Now my point here is that regulation takes effort, and it takes actually energy, and it takes attention. And one of the reasons that kids get better at that as they get older is because they actually get better at paying attention. It's actually related to developments in the prefrontal cortex. I have there like that note that in chapter 4 we spent a bunch of time talking about this, but that one of the reasons kids get better at this is because of these brain developments. One of the most important aspects of the self in middle and late childhood is this increased capacity for self-regulation. A capacity characterized by these deliberate efforts to manage one's behavior, emotions, and thoughts that lead to this increased social competence and achievement. In a study by Blair and colleagues in 2015, higher levels of social control is assessed at 4 years of age, or higher levels of social control in 4-year-olds was linked to improvement in math and reading achievement of early elementary school children living in predominantly rural and low-income contexts or situations. Okay, so higher levels of self-control was linked with improvement in math and reading. Right, and then they're just saying basically in kids with lower income in rural areas, but that's sort of just the demographics of the study. But also interesting. Consistent with Blair's report, a study of almost 1,700, which is a huge sample size, 3 to 7-year-old children revealed that self-regulation was a protective factor for children growing up in low social economic situations, socioeconomic status conditions. That's a study by Flory from 2014. Flory spelled Flouri. I just sometimes will spell the last name if it's a little bit different than how you would maybe phonetically spell it, in case, I don't know, maybe one of you is doing a project that would be relevant. as a cool point. The increased capacity for self-regulation is linked to developmental advances in the brain's prefrontal cortex. This increased focal activation in the prefrontal cortex is linked to improved cognitive control. So one of the ideas is that as the kid's getting older, the temper tantrums are hopefully decreasing because they're better able to use their own thoughts and their own self to regulate. Cognitive control, I have written, I don't know if I turn this, I don't think you'll be able to see it very well. This looks like a light. But I have written in bold at the bottom of this, cognitive control as a term, cognitive control includes self-regulation. Right, so if you were going to say cognitive control as an umbrella concept, self-regulation would be, it's like controlling your mind is part of that. Is, can you use that? It's just another way of saying cognitive control. What's that mean? It's actually a kind of, well, it's a centrally important concept, like your ability to aim. So a big part of cognitive control is aim your mental resources. Big parts of cognitive control are also things like attention, memory, that are not memory, but maybe implementing, not memory its full self, but the operationalization of memory, basically meaning the use of memory, working memory. Yeah, sorry, you don't have to take, I just got rambly there, but it is fascinating, like this cognitive control. It's like it takes energy to control your emotions. It's true for adults too. All right. And just as a, a trailer sneak preview, the next course, so the one that starts in the winter, we're going to get into like, okay, the late teen years and adulthood, and look at sort of how a lot of these things manifest in that context. Okay, so on that, I forgot to mention on that last slide of the PowerPoint, when you download it, I had a link there that said like link to a 3D brain. You should check that out. It's pretty cool. It's like a website where you can like really manipulate the brain and like kind of look from different angles, and I just found it pretty awesome. Both theory of mind research, so this idea that like, I don't know if we touched theory of mind, I think it's coming up later in this presentation, but just really basically this idea that like I have my own thoughts and experiences, and so do you, and I'm aware that you have your own cognitive experience that's unique with mine. You have your own mind. Theory of mind research and more recent research on a young child's social understanding underscore that young children are maybe not as egocentric as Piaget envisioned. Remember, we used that term last time. Piaget's concept of egocentrism has become so ingrained in people's thinking about young children that current research on social awareness in infancy and early childhood is often overlooked. Research increasingly shows that young children are more socially sensitive and perceptive than previously envisioned, suggesting that parents and teachers can help them to better understand and interact in their social world. Let's consider two aspects of perspective taking. Okay, so like your ability to assume what it must be like for me to be the one presenting, and dealing with the fact that I can like also see myself, but I'm trying not to focus on that and trying to talk as if you're actually here, but you're not actually here. But so it's like I'm trying to picture what it'd be like to be you being the student. It's like, and then your ability to do that for me is perspective taking. Let's consider two aspects of perspective taking, defined as this social cognitive process involved in assuming the perspective of others and understanding their thoughts and feelings. One important, which is the definition up on the screen, one important aspect of perspective taking involves this idea of joint commitments. My daughter's over there playing with Harvey, and they're right at an important part of the game. I say, Evie, come here for a sec. I need to tell you something. She comes over and she's like, what? And she's like almost itching to get back. And it's, what do I mean by that? 'Cause she's obviously not literally itching. That's just kind of illustrative language. It's what's actually happening is part of her joint cognitive commitment with Harvey there is almost pulling her back. Sorry, I heard the baby cry for a second there and it made me pause. When pulled away from a game, 3 and 4-year-olds, children who had previously made a joint commitment to play with the experimenter, were more likely to acknowledge that they were leaving than were children in non-committal control groups. Right? It's like, then they start playing the game with the person, and they're like, okay, then maybe the mom, it doesn't say tons about the experimental design, I should add a bit more, but I'll just add it and make it up. So say that the kid's playing a game and the experimenter at some point with like another kid or like an older kid that's being like an actor in the study, right? And this is just totally just like they're playing a board game. Mom is sitting over here, and then at some point mom's going to stand up and say, okay, it's time to go. And it's like, does the kid just go, or does the kid kind of say like, sorry, I gotta leave early, and go? Because if they say like, sorry, I gotta leave early and go, that means like part of their mind is committed to the game, joint commitment. So this is the idea, is that one of the changes that we're seeing as the kids entering this like childhood age is their ability to take another person's perspective is increased because, well, you're seeing this now, joint commitment. This, I know that you know that we're both doing something, and that saying, sorry, I gotta go early, is actually just like a verbal manifestation that shows that you know that. Right, which is kind of the one of the most difficult things about early childhood education and child psychology and child developmental psychology is a lot of what you're dealing with is inferences, right? You're assuming a child is processing this way because they're responding in this way, and we're trying to perspective take them, really. I kind of stumbled into that, but that's a decent point, that most of developmental psychology is trying to perspective take of children, right? And eventually brain scanning will get so advanced. A second important part of a child's social emotional development is gaining an understanding that people don't always tell the truth. So now think about this. It's like these are two things. Well, it's kind of devastating. It's like as soon as the child realizes that they can lie, they also realize that they can be lied to. I have there the birth of skepticism. So here's a kind of interesting quick point, that my ability to take your perspective is kind of dependent on two things. Number one, I have to sort of stop taking my perspective for a second. Again, we're just trying to kind of put words to these complex psychodynamics or cognitive dynamics, and it's like you're trying to sort of control your perspective so you have time to have the cognitive flexibility to for a second hold in your mind what you think it would be like to be me for a second or whatever, right? It's like there's this ability to pause this and purposely do this cognitive inhibition, to put the brakes on a little bit, controlling one's thoughts to consider the perspective of another, and that's matched with this cognitive flexibility, or this ability to cognitively imagine what processing a situation differently would feel like. Perhaps it should not be surprising that perspective taking improves during childhood, given its reliance on executive function. As the executive functioning of the brain is getting stronger, so are these two specific aspects of that. To engage in perspective taking, children must exhibit both cognitive inhibition and cognitive flexibility. So I'll say that last sentence again because it's kind of the key one, which is both basically just for it to be perspective taking, it has to be both of those. To engage in perspective taking, children must exhibit both cognitive inhibition and cognitive flexibility. So it's also at this age that children are starting to understand things like gender and gender identity, and how that's starting to link with their understanding of their social situation and what gender roles are these like sort of expectations from our society of how you're supposed to act as a female or as a male, and maybe act and think and feel. And during the preschool years, most children are increasingly acting in ways that match their culture's prescriptions of those gender roles. So if we were to look at the biology side, so like everything, it's nature, nurture, and people have tried to look at these from different ways. And in a second, we're going to look at some more social role theory and more nurture ways of interpreting this. If you were looking at this from a biological perspective, you'd be talking about things like we did earlier in the course around chromosomes and hormones and evolution. And I'd refer you to work by people like Buss, BUSS 2015, Hines, HINES 2015, Johnson 2017. Those are all actually referenced in the textbook, but those are all kind of, so one's about chromosomes, one's about hormones, and one's about evolution. So basically this is just saying, like, all these topics, there's the nature and nurture component, and I wanted to kind of touch on that because now I'm going to talk about some of these more nurture or kind of constructivist views of the understanding of gender. So people making arguments around this topic of gender that are not based on biology and evolution are likely making what we would kind of consider social theories of gender. So these are going to include both social and cognitive theories. So three main theories of early gender have been proposed, and we're going to look at here: social role theory, psychoanalytic theory, and social cognitive theory. And social role theory, to a degree, is probably the easiest to explain, and it's this idea of, well, what's a role, right? A role is, if I was to say, like, one of you is going to be playing the role of a police officer and one of you is going to be playing the role of a doctor in this show we're going to be making, and so go get costumes for that. You sort of know what they dress like and maybe what they're supposed to act like or whatever, and it's like the role of the movie, right? So this is the idea that people sort of, as they're growing up, are exposed to information that informs how they see the role of the genders are supposed to be played. And supposed to in quotes, right? Because you could obviously critique this, right? And in developmental psychology, remember, this isn't like, you could obviously make arguments about the way society does this and stuff like that. The point I'm making is, all of that considered, this, whatever the society state is at, whatever problems it has or doesn't have, the society is absolutely informing the child's understanding to some degree, in addition to some of the other factors we talked about on the last slide. And someone that really kind of hit this in a very interesting way is a researcher named Alice Eagerly, who proposed this idea, and that's spelled E-A-G-L-Y, proposed this idea of social role theory, which states that gender differences result from these contrasting or differing roles of men and women. In most cultures around the world, women are depicted as maybe having less power or status than men do and controlling fewer resources. This is Eagleson's work from 2017. In Eagle's view, as women adapted to roles with less power and less status in society, they showed more cooperative, less dominant profiles than men did. Thus, social hierarchies and divisions of labor are important because of gender differences in power, assertiveness, and nurture. Again, this is from Eagle's work. Now, while I think there's certainly something to be said about the fact that kids learn the roles for all kinds of things, and certainly gender too. The social role idea, I think, is somewhat simplistic, but I don't know, also kind of not. Right? And we use the social role, but think of how we use that word in different contexts. We talk about role models, that the models that people see in their life shape the people they become. Freud had a difficult idea to explain around this. One of his most difficult is the Oedipus and the Electra. So Electra is a character, a classic female character in a lot of Greek plays, and this over-consuming father, and this, and well, Oedipal is this terrible story of another mythological story of this guy that like accidentally marries his mom and then figures it out and stabs out his own eye, and it's like this very complex story that a lot of people laugh at these ideas, but Freud's trying to talk about these complex relations, and it says this attraction that happens cross, like for a daughter with dad, or with a boy and mom. And I gotta tell you, this is a tough one to explain, and it's, but again, Freud found that so many of the people that he was working with that had trauma, that the trauma came from early, and the trauma came from disturbances in the most fundamental of relationships, and that there was these like archetypes, and there can be the nurturing mother, and there can be the overbearing mother, and there can be the nurturing father, and there can be the tyrant father, and that those relationships mattered. And he used these stories from Greek mythology. And remember, Freud's writing in a time where he's assuming his audience knows these stories, and he's saying it's sort of like this story where, and it's like the lesson from this story and the lesson from this story. So yeah, this is a complex idea, but again, I would look deeply at it before completely dismissing it, like anything from Freud and Jung. So then the last one I wanted to talk about, so we mentioned three, right? So I started with the social role idea, then I touched on the Oedipal and Electra, like the psychodynamic perspective on that, or psychoanalytic perspective, I mean. And then the last one here, this social cognitive theory, or this idea that a child's gender development occurs through observation and imitation. So again, similar to the role model idea, because what are you observing and imitating? People modeling certain behaviors, what other people say and do, and that they're also like rewarded for certain things and not rewarded for certain things, and that there's this like almost operant conditioning aspect of it. So in developmental psychology also, I want to keep stressing this idea that in developmental psychology, a lot of the effort is on trying to document what you see when you observe patterns of behavior. It's not necessarily trying to add moral qualifications to things. When we're looking at how mothers tend to socialize, so socialization on the child from the mother, in many cultures, mothers tend to socialize their daughters to be more obedient, more responsible than their sons. Also placing more restrictions on their autonomy, on their maybe a earlier curfew or things like that. And that although the reasons in different cultures might be different, it seems to be more than just a pattern. Again, when developmental psychologists are doing observational research and looking at what they see when they're observing how fathers interact with their kids, they tend to see more attention to sons than daughters. I can't comment on that from a personal perspective. Obviously, I only have daughters. I don't know, for some reason that point doesn't make sense with me, but that is what the research shows, that fathers tend to engage in more activities that are kind of pushing intellectual development, that are pushing things like skill development, more likely to push their boys towards things like competition and risk taking. So it kind of goes back to this idea that like, and both of those approaches to socializing the kid have tremendous value and are like that way. Because you could say like, okay, so that's this environment shape on the kid, but why are the parents acting that way? And if some of that's their nature, then are we back into this complex nature nurture talk again? So the argument being made by the researchers coming from this perspective of the social cognitive, or what we could more broadly call the nurture side of the nature-nurture debate, is the idea of, and it's not really a debate in the sense, I think it's a useful way of framing a lot of scientific discussion about things. If you're looking at how the sort of environment is shaping the person, you're looking at this idea of, or a lot of people are talking about this idea of how there's greater pressure on boys to conform to traditional male roles than there is for girls. That when we're talking about things like gender, we're often talking more about, on average, boys are like this, or girls are like this, that it's not necessarily going to be manifested in every individual situation due to the tremendous complexity of diversity of human experience, that there's considerable gender overlap, that there's differences that are due to things like biology and things that are due to things like culture and things that are due to the society we live in both, in this classic nature-nurture interaction, and that some people seem to have characteristics of both, and that seems to be something that's been talked about in human civilizations for a long time. And right, so that there's this like androgyny is what I was talking about there. I just kind of tried to make it all into one rant, because it's about how kind of we're cognitively processing these ideas. And that's why, well, this slide's called cognitive influences, the way that this is being experienced cognitively. So I want to change gears here a little bit and just sort of set up where we're going to be going in the second half of the presentation. So I've sort of been, even the discussion of genders is in a lot of ways related to this idea of the emerging concept of self in the child and their emerging understanding of themselves and how they fit into their world. And after the break, in the second part video, part two, I'm going to look more at parenting and different styles of parenting, and so I'm sort of going to set the stage a little bit. But I wanted to have this term in your notes, the difference between what's called emotion coaching and emotion dismissing, and that this is actually a really important distinction in terms of training kids, in terms of even, there's a reason why I have like a picture of like a sports coach there too. It's an important idea that parents can play an important role in helping young children regulate their emotions. Depending on how we talk to children about emotions, parents can help by can be described as taking emotion coaching or emotion dismissing approaches. So this is by research by a guy named Gottman, from 2016, G-O-T-T, Gottman. The distinction between these approaches is most evident in the way that a parent deals with a child's negative emotion. An emotion coaching parent is more likely to monitor their child's emotion, view the negative emotion as an opportunity for teaching, assist and learn in labeling the emotion, and help coach them how to deal effectively with emotions. Not always, obviously, parents aren't perfect, but it's like you see more of this tendency to, like, are you sort of coaching them on how to learn how to handle their emotions, or are you dismissing it and acting by, like, changing negative emotions or making them ignore it or downplaying? Or emotional dismissing parents often view their role as to deny or ignore or change negative emotions. Emotion coaching parents interact with their children in a less rejecting manner, use more scaffolding and praise, and are more nurturant than emotion dismissing parents. Moreover, children of emotion coaching parents are better at soothing themselves when they get upset, are more effective at regulating their negative affect or mood, more focused more focused attention, I wrote that weird, and have fewer behavioral problems than do children of emotional dismissing parents. Okay, so let me just back up because I stumbled that sentence. So if you're comparing these two types of parenting approaches to the child's emotion and you're looking at outcomes performance-wise, you see that when you're taking an emotion coaching position, that's associated with better attention, better at regulating negative mood, less behavioral problems. Studies have found that a father's emotional coaching was related to a child's social competence, and a mother's emotional coaching was linked to less oppositional behaviors. By the time a child gets to about 10, we see them starting to use a lot of kind of cognitive strategies to deal with their stress. is one of the ways we see this is in things like improved emotional understanding. Children in elementary school develop this increased ability to understand complex emotions, things like pride and shame. These emotions become less tied to the reactions of other people. They become more self-generated and integrated with a sense of personal responsibility. Also, during middle and late childhood, as part of their understanding of emotions, children can engage in mental time travel, in which they anticipate and recall the cognitive and emotional aspects of events. Right? They're able to mental time travel, meaning they're able to remember what they felt like before. They're getting better at that, and kind of the emotions of the felt experience are getting tied to their memories better. Right? This increased cognitive ability to remember complexly. They have this increased understanding that more than one emotion can be experienced in a particular situation. A child in grade 3, for example, may realize that achieving something might involve both anxiety and joy. This thing makes me excited and a little bit scared. So again, that's just like an increase in complexity. This ability to suppress or conceal negative emotional reactions. A child in grade 5 is in general learn to tone their ability or tone down their anger better than they used to when they were irritated by a classmate. The use of self-initiated strategies to redirect feelings. In elementary school years, children become more reflective about their emotional lives and increasingly use strategies to control their emotions. They become more effective at cognitively managing their emotions, such as soothing themselves after becoming upset. And then the last one there, this idea of the developing capacity for genuine empathy, that as a child, the child in grade 4, for example, may feel sympathy for a distressed person and experience this vicariously the sadness of that person's feeling. And this is all, it's not that kids couldn't do that at all before, it's that the complexity is getting deeper. All right, my friends, see you in part 2. Cheers.